Hello everyone and welcome to this video where I'll be taking you through how I like to use my gouache paints. I get a lot of questions about it because it might be a bit unusual to how you would normally use it, and so I thought I would make this video kinda explaining it and also talking about my thoughts behind choosing color palettes for my paintings, since it's also something that gets complimented often and honestly is not that complicated and can have a huge effect on the final painting. So first, I would like to talk about my paint of choice. I used to work mostly with watercolor for my entire art career, especially because I didn't know water-based gouache existed. I did own the Holbein acrylic gouache, which I saw everyone else using, but you cannot really mix it with water. And then I discovered that there is something like a water-based gouache. I believe it's sometimes also called tempera. And that has been what I used to now do 95% of my paintings, especially because it's very versatile. You can water it down and it acts similarly to watercolor. However, if you mix it very thick, it's more gouache-like and provides thicker coverage. And I love to have the option to use it both ways. What I like to do with it is put the gouache into my watercolor pen and let it dry. Then I use water to reactivate it later. I had some questions about the reactivating of the paints, whether it takes a long time, whether I sprayed before, and I don't. I think it has mainly to do with this particular brand of gouache I use, which reactivates instantly. You can see it here, it's completely dry now, and immediately after I put water on it, it becomes functional. I think the main reason for putting the gouache into the pens is that I travel a lot, go back to my parents' house over the weekends, paint in a cafe, and I need my gouache to be convenient and portable. The final painting effect doesn't differ much from if you wanted to use them out of the tube. I just don't really like carrying all the tubes with me all the time. If you decide to do this and put your gouache into your palette as well, I guess here comes the tip number 1 that I had to learn the hard way, which is to let the paint dry in layers. I usually do 3 layers, which I let dry overnight each, and that way the paint dries completely throughout, because when you do not do it that way, it stays wet at the bottom of the pan and it kind of crumbles, leaves little residue when you paint, and it might also mold, which never happened to me, but I've heard about it. Here you can see how when I was too impatient and put the color in the pen all at once, this is what happens. Another trick is to use needle, how I do here, or maybe your brush to fill the paint completely so no air bubbles remain. The bubbles inside can be very annoying. And now for the brands. I've tried many brands in my life, and these here are the ones worth mentioning. I'll do a little review here. And a little disclaimer, this is just my personal experience with these brands. I don't want to discourage anyone from trying out the ones I didn't really like. Paint preference is very personal to every artist, and I would love to read yours down in comments, to see what you're using and what you like and don't. This is a Czech brand of tempera and the one I started with, since it's very cheap here and accessible. They have it almost in every art supply store. I've used it for years. I love their watercolor as well. However, with the tone colors, I find that different pigments vary quite a lot and I don't like that. For example, the browns especially, I find granulate a lot, but the yellows and the reds are perfect consistency. I think it has something to do with the pigments they use, which are from different stones. But this varying kind of led me to search for some other brands that would be maybe more consistent. Another brand I used to use quite a lot, but I don't anymore really, is the Pebeo. I think it's the one I bought after Umton because also it's very cheap, very vibrant, and I think it's a great budget option if you want to try out working with paints like this. However, in time I found their shade range is quite lacking, and then again I went to look elsewhere. And now we are getting to the territory of paints I use currently. I love the Schminke gouache, I use it a lot, the quality is excellent. However, these paints are very expensive. I think the tube is around 8 to 10 euros here, which if you need a whole shade range would cost you a lot of money. And also the shade range is very classic, it's wide, they have a lot of colors, but it's all the classic shades you would maybe find in oil paints, which is totally fine. But for me personally, I enjoy the other brands I'm going to mention much more because their shade range is much more unusual and that can be quite inspiring. I would love to give an honorary mention to these Schminke super granulating watercolors, which were gifted to me by Articon, my local and favorite art supply store. I think I'll link them in the bio. They ship all around the EU. I didn't think I would enjoy them as much as I do. The texture on them is excellent, as you can see, and they've also become part of my palette. And the two main brands I personally love are the Windsor and Newton gouache and Holbein. I used to use their watercolor for years. It's also the brand of my palette that I keep using here. These are also a bit pricier since the tubes are quite small, but the colors are amazing and it's just what I need from my paints. And my favorite at the end, the Holbein water-based gouache. It's definitely my most used brand. I love how consistent it is throughout the whole shade range, and especially I love the color selection. They have very unusual shades. For example, these two, the Myocytis blue, the ash green, ash blue, Rikyū gray, these are all my favorite. And once again, we're in the pricier territory. I also couldn't get my hands on these for years since it's a Japanese brand, but now there are a few stores around me that have them, so I can buy all the shades I want. And now let's get to the second part of the video, where I'll be talking about colors and how I like to think about them. I get a lot of compliments regarding my color palettes, so I'd like to try to explain how I go about choosing them. I use quite a simple trick that I'll try to explain now. So basically, with every painting I do, I choose a certain shade of every base color, which are usually these ones. It's yellow, red, light green, dark green maybe, blue, pink when needed, brown when needed. And these are the colors you would usually use in their most basic shades straight out of the tube. But what I like to do is change the shade to a slightly different one of each of these base colors, and then keep it the same throughout the whole project that I'm working on, whether it's a sticker sheet, sketchbook spread, or maybe a whole book or zine. For example, here, this is the classic yellow shade straight out of the tube, and these are some of the options how you can tweak it slightly. Here are some ideas for greens, for blues, for reds, pinks. So I would basically go from a plain base color palette like this to something more like this or this. I usually choose it based on what mood I want the painting to have. And here is what this trick will do to your paintings. It will change them slightly. They definitely won't match the reference picture perfectly now, but it will give it more distinct and cohesive look, especially when you're working on a series of paintings or a sketchbook page. You will not notice the change with one standalone painting, I think, but they will look much more cohesive when displayed in a series. You can also think about the vibe of the painting you'd like to go for. For example, if you want the painting to feel cold, I choose colder shades of each color. Or when you would like the painting to feel vintage or old, I would go for more brownish, warm, muted shades. And here are some examples of what I mean and of my palettes that I used in paintings or projects. This is a page I made for another video on this channel, which I will link above here, I think, and you can go and watch the process of how I painted this. Throughout this whole page, I've used the Naples yellow instead of the usual yellow, and a lot of flesh color for mixing as well. Like, instead of, if I wanted to make a color lighter, I wouldn't use white, but I would use this like flesh pinkish color, and I think it gave the paintings very warm autumnal look, and it's very consistent throughout the page. You can also see the greens. Like, when I would go for a green, I would always go for this like almost khaki warm green. And so I just mentioned another trick I sometimes use to keep my color cohesive, and that is to use a different color than white to mix lighter colors. My favorite is the flesh color, the pinkish salmon, I think, and I find it gives all the colors similar tint. You can see it in the painting here. And next, I wanted to show you an example of a whole project where I've managed to stay consistent with my palette, and I think a great example is this zine I've made. I published it last year about the hiking trip in Swedish Lapland, and the palette here was given by what colors I took with me, which were quite limited. This is the palette I took with me. It's an old chocolate tin, and I use this as my travel palette when I hike and I don't want to carry the huge palette, because, as you know, every gram counts. And you can see it has a limited range of colors, and I think it's pretty visible in mostly the green colors throughout the zine, which are all very similar shades, which gives the whole book a very consistent feel. And another point I think I need to make is that I'm looking at this from like an illustrator perspective. I'm not trying to be as realistic with my paintings, and so therefore I'm not going for like the perfect shade of green that's I saw, but maybe, you know, it's more like a vehicle to, or a tool to make the painting feel how I want. Over the time, I've managed to curate my own palette of my own favorite shades, as I think many artists do. I wanted to include it here so you can maybe be a bit inspired, and I do encourage you to do the same. Find shades you like, put them into your palette and incorporate them in your art. Choosing the right color palette is definitely something that you need to practice and explore. I have a few pages in my sketchbook where I just mix shades of different colors to see how they look and how they complement each other. And you can also find a lot of inspiration in other artists' work. I love to study color palettes of others, sometimes even classical artists. I put them down in my sketchbook if, for example, I like the contrast of two different colors next to each other. And the third advice of how to explore more color variation in your work would be to just look around you. There's so many exciting colors everywhere, and I love to look at people's outfits, for example, flowers, yarn colors when I knit or when I'm choosing a yarn. I try to do this practice quite often when I look at object, and I try to not look at the object as like the shape and stuff, but just the color, just separating the color from, or the shade of color from everything else. And we used to do this little exercise in the art lessons when I was a little kid, where the teacher would make these little rectangular scopes by cutting a hole in a paper. And the goal would be to explore colors around you, focus on them more by using this little frame so you don't get distracted by how the object looks. I would encourage you to do so. It's so much fun. I wanted to try this for this video, so I made this little scope, went outside with my sketchbook and put down the colors that caught my eye. Here you can see some of the colors I ended up putting down, and as I said, I had a lot of fun doing it. So I hope you found this video informative, hopefully helpful as well. As always, if you have any questions, put them down in the comments. I'll try to answer all of them, and I would also love to hear maybe your recommendations for gouache, and so I can maybe try something new. We'll see. And have fun as always, explore, and see you in the next video.